Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, this is only my second visit to Gustavus Adolphus, and yet this college occupies a special place in my affection and memories. I confided the reason to some of you when I was here before, but I'd like to share it, I think, with this new and wider audience this evening. For you to understand this special affection, you must know that I was raised in China without sisters, and in a city where for most of the years we were the only Americans. And this meant that as a boy, virtually all the girls I saw had straight black hair and coal black eyes. So the scene was set for an absolute contrast when, on the ship that brought me to the United States and to college, there chanced to be a girl with a Swedish name. That name I shall not disclose, but I will tell you that her hair was shining gold and her eyes were sapphire. And she was bound for Gustavus Adolphus. Well, 17 is an impressionable age, and a sea voyage is an impressionable setting. And by the time the days had lapsed and our ship had landed, I was, to revert to Sir John's phrase this morning, I was again a pre-Copernican. None of this relativity business. The sun rose and set on St. Peter, Minnesota. Or to turn to the language of the mythology of primitives, St. Peter was the navel of the universe. Well, 30 years have lapsed and much has happened, and yet in a way I feel confirmed. My reasons for thinking so may be somewhat different this evening, but it still does seem to me that Gustavus Adolphus is quite a special place. And I thank you for this opportunity, for being here, and for the chance to take part in this conference. Now, as all the speakers up to this point have stressed, in ratio to what there is to be known about the human mind, what we at present do know is small. And my remarks, I'm afraid, are not aimed at adding to this knowledge of mind as much as to removing a misconception about it, though hopefully this latter project may contribute indirectly to the former. What I wish to challenge is the notion that the human mind is essentially a digital computer. Much, of course, turns on the word "is" here. Given the fact that everything in the universe is in some way both like and unlike everything else in the universe, we can conclude a priori that minds resemble computers in some ways and not in others. For my thesis to be interesting, then, it must be made more precise. So let me reform it as follows. Human minds, in addition to being able to think in the way, though not with the speed, that computers can, human minds can also perform in other ways which computers, at present at least, cannot simulate. These latter ways, moreover, can be specified and constitute the grounds for stressing the difference between human and artificial intelligence. Now, before I plunge into the problem, I should like to share with you just a bit of introspection. All of us are aware by now of the extent to which our thoughts are influenced by our values. And so I'd like to try to lay my values out on the table at the outset, in as much as I'm aware of these values, not so much to try to persuade you to them as perhaps just the opposite, to warn you to be on the lookout for them where they may affect my argument. The chief value premise of which I am aware is that I find myself hoping that there are differences between men and machines. I'm aware that there are others who seem to cherish the opposite hope. In this other group are many of the men who are actually working on artificial intelligence. As evidence, let me cite two passages from the best collection of papers that has yet appeared on the subject, brought together in a book titled Computers and Thought by Edward Feigenbaum and Julian Feldman. In this first passage I'm going to quote, they ask, "Is it possible for a computing machine to think?" And they answer, "No. If one postulates that there is something in the essence of thinking which is inscrutable, mysterious, mystical. Yes, if one admits that the question is to be answered by experiment and observation, comparing the behavior of the computers with the behavior of human beings to which the term thinking is generally applied." And they conclude, "We regard the negative view as unscientifically dogmatic." Now, I'm not concerned in this passage with the way this phrasing of the issue tends to link those who are concerned with the differences between men and machines with being unscientifically dogmatic, opposed to observation and experiment, and favoring mystification. I cite the passage rather to show the way in which the author's choice of language evidences the desire for machines to be able to do what men do. This desire comes through even more clearly in a second passage drawn from the same book, and I quote, "Is there any reason to suppose that computers will never reach the capabilities of human intelligence? None whatever. Not a single piece of evidence, no logical argument, no proof or theorem has ever been advanced which demonstrates an insurmountable hurdle along the continuum." Now, the reason that many, though not all, workers in artificial intelligence hope that machines equaling human minds can be built, these reasons are not far to seek. The human mind is, of course, a glorious achievement, and insofar as scientists succeed in duplicating it, glory is deservedly theirs. In addition, human minds are useful, so that producing their like, or better, would be to benefit society. So the question rises, why resist the comparison between men and machines? The chief reason is that the comparison seems to demean us. Perhaps it shouldn't do so. We don't value birds less now that machines can fly, even faster and higher than they can. But there's a difference here. Flying is something birds do, whereas thinking, in its inclusive genre, comes close to what we are, close enough for Aristotle to define man as a rational animal, and Descartes to define him as a thinking substance. The appropriate comparison to planes that fly like birds is cars that run like men and other animals. Cars and other machines that simulate certain of our activities don't threaten our self-image, as would the conviction that we are machines. Machines are not free. They have no will or feelings. Traits like nobility, heroism, and compassion don't fit them. So insofar as minds are like machines or are machines, they don't deserve these attributes either. The only escape I can see from this conclusion, assuming that my premises are accurate, is to factor intelligence out from other aspects of the human self, a la some form of faculty psychology, and say that man thinks like machines, but differs from machines in other ways, for example, in having emotions. But the notion of thought as thus compartmentalized and shut off from other aspects of ourselves seems as implausible as it is unappealing. Now, up to this point, I've addressed myself to value questions and trying to indicate the particular angle from which this issue of computer and human intelligence interests me. But now it's time to get over into the facts of the case. And let me say in doing so that I should be leaning very heavily on the work of one of my colleagues in philosophy at MIT, Hubert Dreyfus. He has written 2 items, one titled Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence, which was a report for the RAND Corporation, and another Phenomenology and Artificial Intelligence, and is currently working on a book which will appear as a Harper Torchback when it is completed. I'm not going to extend your listening patience by making constant references to his thoughts on specific issues. Let me simply say in a general way that we've been talking together for some 9 months on this, and I'm indebted to him immensely for the thoughts that follow. The achievements of artificial intelligence, especially in such areas as automation, data processing, and simulation, have been, of course, spectacular. There's no need to recount those wonders here. Instead, we focus on the other side of the picture, areas in which optimistic claims have not been substantiated. There are areas in which initial impressive success has leveled off onto a plateau. In areas such as game playing, language translation, and pattern recognition, a pattern is taking shape. An early dramatic success based on the easy performance of simple tasks, and then diminishing returns, disenchantment, and in some instances pessimism. This could mean, of course, that it's just a matter of time until the problems are surmounted and progress resumes. The alternative is that artificial intelligence programs have encountered a kind of knowing of which digital computers are intrinsically incapable. If so, identification of these 2 kinds of knowing might shed light on what knowing involves and what, in the knowing process, is distinctively human. Now, by artificial intelligence here, we mean that exemplified by digital computers, inasmuch as these are the only high-speed, all-purpose information processing devices we presently know how to design or even clearly to conceive. The fundamental characteristic of such digital computers is that all information with which they operate must be presented in binary bits. That is, in terms of a series of yeses or nos, of switches being open or closed. The 2 programs in terms of which the capacities and limitations of digital computers are to be assessed this evening are the chess program and language translation. We begin then with the chess program. In 1957, and you'll recognize that, just a decade ago, H.A. Simon, one of the originators in the field of chess-playing programs, predicted that within a decade the world's chess champion would be a machine, unless it were to be disqualified on technical grounds. Well, the decade is now up, actually not, because he made it in November, so it still has about 11 months to go. But where do things now stand? In their few recorded games, chess machines thus far have played poor but legal chess, and in the last reported game, the machine was beaten in 35 moves by a 10-year-old novice. Now, what is the problem here? It is a problem inevitably connected with very large choice mazes, namely exponential growth. Some games are simple enough to be programmed to win or draw every time. Nim and tic-tac-toe are the obvious examples. Other games are too complicated for this, and yet admit of machines that can be programmed to play them very well. Here, checkers is perhaps the best example. In checkers, only 2 kinds of moves are possible. Captures are forced, and pieces block one another. Under such restrictions, it is possible to explore all the possibilities to a depth of 20 moves or so, which turns out to be sufficient to play a very good game of checkers. In chess, however, the situation is radically different. There, it is impossible to run through all the branching possibilities far enough even to form a reliable judgment as to whether a given branch is sufficiently promising to merit further exploration. One of the workers in the field has estimated that the possible paths which a game of chess might take is something in the order of 10 to the 120th power, which I think we can agree is an overwhelming number. In the face of this problem of unmanageable exponential growth, how do programmers proceed? Well, they begin by asking how human players cope with the problem, since it is unlikely that human minds actually run through all these astronomical number of possibilities. Certainly human players aren't aware of doing so. Then human players, so the computers reason, must rely on what they call heuristics, or rules of thumb. For example, don't explore any move that puts your queen in immediate danger. Such heuristics could in principle prune the exponential tree substantially, possibly to the point of rendering it manageable. The difficulty here is that no successful heuristics have been found. All current heuristics either exclude some possibly good moves or leave open the possibility of exponential growth. Unable then to think through all the logical possibilities and lacking reliable rules of thumb to guide him, how does a human player actually proceed? Well, in some way, he seems to zero in on a promising situation. That is, he finds his attention drawn to it before he begins the task of counting out. That is, counting through the various possibilities by brute force enumeration. It's this difference between zeroing in and counting out that merits our attention. Once into his game, a human player is not aware of explicitly considering or excluding from consideration any of hundreds of possibilities that would have to be enumerated if he were proceeding by counting out. Instead, something in the board's overall configuration directs his attention to an area within it. In Michael Polanyi's description, and I quote, "Seen thus from the corner of our eyes, or remembered at the back of our mind, an area not at the center of our attention compellingly affects the way we see the object on which we are focusing. We may indeed go so far as to say that we are aware of this subsidiarily noticed area mainly in the appearance of the object to which we are attending." This phenomenon has been systematically studied by phenomenologists in their account of perceptual horizons. Human awareness is horizontal in two ways, and since both involve experience that is partially indeterminate, neither can be directly reproduced by a digital computer. First, there is the basic figure ground phenomenon, which human perception invariably exemplifies. Whatever is prominent in our experience or engages our attention appears on a background which remains more or less indeterminate. This background, which need never be made determinate, nevertheless affects the appearance of what is determinate by causing it to appear in many ways, one way being causing it to appear as a unified, bounded figure. We can characterize the figure as having certain determinate characteristics, whereas the background can only be characterized as that which is not the figure. an example that Jean-Paul Sartre uses. He says, when I enter a cafe looking for Pierre, the cafe appears to me as simply the not Pierre against which Pierre's face suddenly emerges. End of quote. Now, how does one feed into a computer a cafe so that it appears as not Pierre to one percipient, appears as a bohemian atmosphere exciting the romantic imaginings of another, as a magnificent scene for a Toulouse-Lautrec painting to a third, and so on? Of course, once you have decided how you want the cafe to appear, as fringe or focus, and if as fringe for what focus, then you know how to characterize the cafe to the computer. You know which of its near infinite, some would say literally infinite, potential features to feed into the machine. Human awareness differs in being fringed by an indeterminate horizon which is unpredictable in two ways. One, in the way it affects what is in focus, and second, indeterminate in what from out of the horizon can suddenly jump into focal, determinate attention. This indeterminacy plays a crucial role in human perception. Merleau-Ponty points out that something must be put into the background if something is to be perceived in the foreground. I quote a passage from him. When Gestalt theory informs us that a figure on a background is the simplest sense datum available to us, we reply that this is not a contingent characterization of factual perception. It is the very definition of the phenomenon of perception. The perceptual something is always in the middle of something. It always forms part of a field. End of quote. It is this outer horizon, as Husserl calls it, which in chess does not have to be explicitly considered, yet which provides the context of the specific counting out, so that one always has a sense of the relevance of the moves considered to the rest of the game. For a computer, which must take up every bit of information explicitly or not at all, this outer horizon would not be a horizon. For to be taken into account at all, it would have to be just as determinate as is the figure. But this outer horizon does not tell the whole story of the way the background contributes to the player zooming in on one area of the board instead of another. There is a second kind of perceptual indeterminacy noted by Husserl in Gestalt psychology, what Husserl calls the inner horizon. In perceiving an object, we are aware that it has more aspects than we are at the moment considering. Moreover, once we have experienced these further aspects, they will be co-present as concealed by what is directly presented. It seems as if we perceive the whole object, even its hidden aspects, because the concealed aspects directly affect our perception. For example, once I have reason to believe that the front of the house that I'm looking at is in fact a facade, from that point on it actually looks different to me than the way it did before. Or to take another example, this last summer in the airport at Addis Ababa, I was startled to see ahead of me a young girl whose back looked identical with my daughter's. I caught up with her, and when I saw her face, it was a tremendous shock because it didn't look at all like my daughter's. Now the relevant point, whereafter her back ceased to appear to me as my daughter's back. Phenomenology does not explain the mechanism by which horizons affect perception, but it does describe the way in which information can remain on the fringes of consciousness and affect the appearance of the objects on which human attention focuses. It calls our attention to the fact that information can be taken into account without being completely determinate and without occupying the center of our attention. Such information processing is constantly at work in organizing human experience. In chess, the player's familiarity with the overall pattern at various stages and with the past moves of this particular game enables him to recognize the lines of force, the locus of strength and weakness, as well as specific positions. He sees that his opponent looks vulnerable in a certain area, just as one familiar with houses in general and with a certain house sees it as if it had a sort of back. And then the chess player, zeroing in on this area, discovers the unprotected rook. If cybernetics workers nevertheless go on trying to develop a digital chess-playing program, it is because they persist in believing that human information processing, no matter how different it appears, must be understandable in digital terms. Thus, they are forced to say that even if we are conscious of zooming in, unconsciously we must be, in fact, counting out. We come then to the second theory of artificial intelligence workers as to how human chess players, quote, zero in. The first theory was that they used heuristics or rules of thumb, which, however, as we have pointed out, remains a conjecture since no valid ones have been discovered. The second theory is that human minds count out, but unconsciously. However, this second theory faces difficulties too. If the human player has been unconsciously counting out thousands of alternatives to get to the point where he focuses on that rook, why doesn't he carry on with this unconscious process all the way to the end until the best move just pops into his consciousness? Why, if unconscious counting is rapid and accurate, does he resort at the particular point where he spots the rook to a cumbersome method of slowly, awkwardly, and consciously counting things out? This consideration, of course, doesn't prove that unconscious processing is not digital, but it does seem to put the burden of proof on those who claim that it is or must be. What epistemological lessons can we derive from the computer chess-playing program as it stands today? Following Merleau-Ponty and Dreyfus, I will call any psychological theory which attempts to analyze human information processing in terms of the searching and combining of determinate bits of information, I will call that theory associationism. It is immaterial for our considerations whether these determinate elements are associated by habits or by rules connecting their representations in consciousness. Thus, from the phenomenological point of view, Hume, Kant, and artificial intelligence theorists are all associationists, and all, for this reason, have difficulty in accounting for horizontal consciousness and the kind of information processing it facilitates. In the case of game playing, this distinction between associationist and gestaltist forms of information processing underlies the distinction between counting out and zeroing in, and explains the early success and later slowdown in this area of artificial intelligence. In all game-playing programs, early success is attained by working on those games or parts of games in which counting out is feasible. Failure occurs when global awareness is necessary to avoid exponential growth. The difficulties of artificial intelligence thus call our attention to the necessity for a non-associationist function of consciousness, a non-digital form of information processing. And now to the other area, which is that of language translation. The hope here, of course, is for fully automatic, high-quality language translation. In the last decade, 5 government agencies have turned $16 million to this end. With what results? Well, relatively quickly, it was discovered that a mechanical dictionary could be constructed in which linguistic items, be they parts of words, whole words, or groups of words processed independently, could be converted one after another into the corresponding items in another language. Unsolved are, first, the problem of selecting an appropriate target correspondent for a source word on the basis of context. And second, the problem of establishing a unique syntactic structure for a sentence that human readers find unambiguous. These 2 unsolved problems are so formidable that Anthony Edinger, director of the Harvard University Computation Center, concludes that, and I quote, "For those who still cherish the hope for fully automatic high-quality translation, the outlook is grim." End of quote. To understand the difficulty facing mechanical translation, we need to distinguish between the generation of grammatical and meaningful sentences and the understanding of such sentences in instances of their use. There is no reason in the light of present evidence to doubt the capacity of linguists eventually to formulate rules for generating any sentence which native speakers recognize as grammatical and meaningful, and excluding all sentences they reject as ungrammatical or meaningless. The remaining difficulty is native speakers are able to interpret unequivocally sentences which, according to the rules, can be generated in several different ways and therefore can have several different grammatical structures and several legitimate meanings. One way the native speaker can narrow down this legitimate ambiguity is by appealing to geographical setting in which the sentence appears. Let's take an example here. Suppose you were to hear the sentence, "The pen is in the book." Well, there's no problem about that. I suppose we might conjure up an image of someone reading, and maybe the telephone rings, and he wants to keep his place, so he reaches for his pen, puts his pen in his book. But now, suppose you were to hear, "The book is in the pen." Well, that might sound a little bit odd, unless it were, say, spoken in a nursery, when you might sense at once that it meant that the baby's story book, picture book, was in the playpen. Or if you were walking with, it was said by a friend when you were walking with him out on the farm, in which a typical case, you might infer that somehow the book got into the pig pen. If you were in a social evening where people were talking about writers and what they had done and hadn't done, and one of the participants had a recognized flair for poetic usage, and he said, speaking of an author, that the book is in the pen, we might take it as a kind of colorful way of saying the book has not been written, it's still in the pen. Or if you were to encounter that sentence in the context of a James Bond novel, in which case, you see, the book might be a book of top secrets, which had been microfilmed and physically placed inside a hollow fountain pen. Again, note the way in which the meaning of "stand by me" can turn on whether one's friend is going on trial or going on parade. Of course, after we notice what it is in the context or the horizon that affects the meaning of a sentence, we can instruct computers to note whether or not that something is present. The problem is to build machines which resemble human minds in being able to resolve ambiguities encountered for the first time. The number of ways in which contexts can affect meanings is indefinite. How does one program a machine to take account, as it goes about its work, of the near infinity, some say literal infinity, of ways in which contexts can affect meanings? It is difficulties such as these which make Edinger and Bar Hillel, leading workers in the field, skeptical of the possibility of fully automatic, high-quality machine translation. Bar Hillel claims that such considerations are enough to demonstrate that machine translation is not feasible, if only because there would be no way of sorting through the enormous, and Bar Hillel is one of those who says infinite, quantity of information which might be relevant to determining the meaning of any specific utterance. Still, the inability to systematize all knowledge about the world need not in itself discourage the advocates of artificial intelligence. Scientific descriptions are constantly being modified to take into account new facts. No scientist thinks that the laws formulated thus far will account for all future observations. Each time the program fails to resolve the ambiguity in the same way as a native speaker would, the machine must simply be told what new information is relevant or given new rules for using the information it already has. The linguist need not present a complete theory whose rules can explain every utterance recognized as legitimate by native speakers. Like any scientist, he can trail behind experience, approximating human performance more and more closely. In doing so, he assumes that he is discovering the rules that human speakers were obeying all along, since the human speakers recognized the use in question as legitimate. In general, he must hold that when two speakers understand each other in a consistent way, their use of language, since it is not arbitrary, must be rule-like. But what does this notion that human language is rule-like say to cases in which a native speaker recognizes that a certain linguistic usage is odd and yet is able to understand it? As, for example, the phrase we used, the idea, or like close to the one we used, if we say the idea is in the pen. A machine at this point with rules for what sort of physical objects can be in pig pens, play pens, and fountain pens will not be able to apply its rules. Since an idea is not a physical object, the machine can at best make an arbitrary guess. The listener's understanding, on the other hand, is far from arbitrary. He may feel that he gets the point, and the speaker may agree on the basis of his response that he has understood. Does it follow, then, that in understanding or using the odd utterance, the human speakers were acting according to rule? To the speakers who recognize the utterance as odd, it doesn't seem like it. This case takes us to the heart of a fundamental difficulty facing the simulators. Programmed behavior is either arbitrary or strictly rule-like. Therefore, in confronting a new usage, a machine must either treat it as a clear case falling under the rules or take a blind stab. A native speaker has a third alternative. He can recognize the usage as odd, not falling under the rules, and yet he can make sense of it, give it a meaning in a non-rule-like and yet non-arbitrary way. Outright misuse of language demonstrates an even more extreme form of this ability. People often understand each other, even when one of the speakers makes a grammatical or semantic mistake. The utterance may not only be outside the rules, but actually proscribed by them. And yet such violations are often so easily understood that they are not even noticed. Humans, confronted with these odd cases and outright errors, adapt as they go along and then reflect on the revisions they have made. A machine has either to fail first and then, when given the correct answer, revise its rules to take account of this new usage, or it would have to have all the rules, even the rules for how to break the rules and still be understood, built into it beforehand. To adopt the first approach, failing first and revising later, would be to admit that in principle, not just in practice, machines must always trail behind people. This would be to admit that digital computers do not process information the way people do. Human beings do not seem to disambiguate through applying rules covering all possible cases that are explicitly built in or learned. Logically, it is difficult to see how one could formulate the rules for how one could intelligibly break the rules, for no matter what meta-rules are formulated, it seems intuitively obvious that the native speaker could break them too, and count on the context to get his meaning across to another speaker. Thus, no matter what order of meta-rules one chooses, it seems there will be a higher order of tacit understanding about how to break these rules and still be understood. Moreover, as in the case of chess, there is the question of the relation between conscious and unconscious. If every understandable use of language is covered by rules of which we are unconscious, why should some of these uses appear odd to us on the conscious level? Why, if we have such a battery of rules and lightning-fast capacity for using them on the unconscious level, should we be left consciously struggling with cases that seem puzzling? If, in the face of the practical and phenomenological difficulties involved in a rule-like theory of human disambiguation, the artificial intelligence workers continue to hold that a machine model must be possible, it is clearly for a priori, not for empirical reasons. We must now turn to this a priori assumption. The difficulties encountered in trying to make a digital model which could store and utilize an enormous number of facts are, of course, in part, the difficulties inherent in the associationist model of mental processes. As in chess, if one had to take up explicitly and reject or accept all the possibly relevant facts, the calculations involved would rapidly become unwieldy. Obviously, most of the facts and much of our processing must be left to horizontal awareness. But in the case of language, unlike chess, the most fundamental difficulties are not psychological, but metaphysical. The fundamental difficulty is not that machines, lacking horizontal consciousness, cannot deal with combinatorial complexities. Rather, our ability to recognize and understand oddness suggests that what has to be dealt with may not be formalizable at all. The cues in question do not seem to be the sort of determinate data which could be taken in, let alone processed, by a digital computer. Pascal, the inventor of the calculator, also understood its limitations. He noted that the esprit de finesse functions, I quote, tacitly, naturally, and without technical rules, unquote. Wittgenstein has spelled out this thesis in the case of language, and I quote Wittgenstein, in general, we don't use language according to strict rules. It hasn't been taught us by means of strict rules either, end of quote. The worker in mechanical translation must assume that human speech consists of unique and precisely definable reactions to precisely definable situations. But are the cues we use in understanding a natural language determinate data, information bits, which can be manipulated according to formal rules? The traditional metaphysician, reincarnated now as the artificial intelligence researcher, grants that some facts get their significance in terms of situation, but argues that in order to use a setting to interpret the facts, we must first be able to pick out some features which identify it. Beyond the technical problems which plague pattern recognition, situation recognition raises special theoretical difficulties. Certainly, if the number of simple facts is in some sense infinite, the number of facts which might be relevant for recognizing the situation is infinite too. How is the machine to consider all the features such as temperature, pressure, what day of week it is, how many people are involved, and so on, any one of which might be the defining feature in some particular context? Once the situation is recognized, the few relevant facts can be selected and their significance determined. But how is one to recognize the situation? Either the possibly relevant features must be specified by specific rules, as in chess, where the location and color of the pieces are relevant, but not their temperature and weight, or the context in which the search for significant features is being made will have to be used to determine which of the infinity of features are relevant to identify the situation. But if in turn the program must identify the broader situation in terms of its significant features, and this is the only way a computer could proceed, then the programmer will face an infinite regress of contexts, something like Wittgenstein's regress of rules for applying rules. A machine must always proceed from specific elements to the whole. But in this case, the whole is necessary in order to pick out the significant elements. One can envision a general theory of syntactics and semantics. The disambiguation of actual utterances, however, can only be worked out for restricted cases. Or, as we put it earlier, the formation of well-formed sentences by native speakers can in principle be exhaustively anticipated. The disambiguation of actual utterances of these sentences can only be formalized after the fact. Concerned about time, but there are only 2 more pages, so we'll make it. We see that the ambition of the workers in mechanical translation rests on an ontological or metaphysical claim. The claim not only that the way we process information can be formalized and represented in a series of discrete steps so as to be simulated on a digital computer, but further that the information itself can be made exhaustively explicit and determinate so that it can be fed into a machine. Merleau-Ponty calls this assumption that whatever is can be treated as a set of atomic facts. He calls it the préjugé du monde, and Heidegger calls it the rechnende Denken, or calculating thought, and views it as the goal of philosophy in the bad sense, culminating in technology. Thus, for Heidegger, technology, with its insistence on the thoroughgoing calculability of objects, is the inevitable culmination of metaphysics, the concern of beings to the exclusion of being in the singular. In Der Satz vom Grund, Heidegger remarks that, and I quote, "the determination of language as information originally supplies the sufficient reason for the construction of thinking machines and for the construction of large-scale computer installations, and that information theory is, as pronouncement, already the arrangement whereby all objects are put in such form as to assure man's domination over the entire earth and even the planets." End of quote. It is thus less sensational but more appropriate that in his recent UNESCO address, Heidegger cites cybernetics, no longer the atomic bomb, as the culmination of philosophy in what he conceives to be its misguided sense. Now, I would like to tack on 2 short codas. someone, in hearing an earlier version of a paper which had much of this material in the discussion session afterwards, pointed out that computers and artificial intelligence, cybernetics, is scarcely more than, say, 15 years old. And he raised the question, in view of that fact, aren't you strangling babies in their cradles? Well, that set me back a bit. If that be what it is, I want to disclaim it. To me, a different image seems more appropriate. I would say I have no desire to strangle babies in their cradles. Rather, what it seems to me like what I am doing is to point out that even if a chimpanzee be placed in a cradle, that doesn't make it a human baby. The other coda that I would like to append is that I wonder whether, in the end, a careful assessment of computers' strengths and limitations may not cause us to reassess our human abilities. That is to say, heretofore, I think we have been inclined, certainly Western philosophers have been inclined, to regard clear, explicit, logical reasoning as our crowning human capacity, this being what marks us off from the lower animals. But if machines can reason in some technical sense, and indeed in that sense reason better than we can, without this inducing us to consider them really superior to ourselves, we may be moved to take a new look at faculties other than our disengagedly rational ones, with the result of finding in some of these other faculties the basis of our superiority. For example, H.A. Simon, one of the leading computer pioneers whom I've quoted a couple of times, raises this point obliquely when he says, isn't it odd that the capacities we're having real trouble getting machines to simulate are not the higher order faculties confined to man, but rather ones which man shares with the lower animals? If computers do thus cause us to revise our estimate of what is supremely human, the implications for education, too, could be important. If machines can store more information and retrieve it faster than we can, and reason more logically, more extensively, more rapidly, and accurately than we can in certain precise ways, what is our distinctive vocation? What is the distinctively human opportunity, and how can it be maximized? Thank you. Well, the first question my eye falls upon is how do we know that when the way an individual sees, say, a bohemian cafe, this way is not just programmed by his environment? Well, I think I revert here to what Sir John said about dogs and whether they know that they know or not. That is, there's no way of knowing that one is not programmed to see it in some absolutely determined way that's predetermined way. But neither do we know that he is, and it's really the freedom versus determinism issue here, and it seems to me that one would not be inclined to take the deterministic view unless for some reasons that had come in advance of the immediate experience. That's not to say that it's not true. But here again, we're up against an issue where there is, at this stage, I think, no possibility of demonstrating either that we are totally pre-programmed in advance or that we're not. your no valid heuristics seems contradicted by GPS in Simon Newell, Computers and Thought. I'm trying to think. Simon and Newell, Computers and Thought, where they claim that there are valid heuristics. I take it that's the this is an ideal, of course, and a necessity in most programming. But the question is whether in chess there are valid heuristics, and does he name valid heuristics for chess in that article? Oh, well, in principle, certainly one looks for heuristics, and in certain areas they are available. My reference was not against heuristics in general. These are necessary and utilized effectively, continuously. But it's a question of whether in chess valid heuristics have thus far been found. And I don't recall in this that he indicates that they have been found. But were you speaking specifically of heuristics in chess, and does he name ones which are valid? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I meant specifically that discussion occurred in the context of the chess playing programs, and with regard to chess, no valid heuristics have been found. Do not recursive rules provide a way out of the infinite regression of rules to apply rules? Reference to Wittgenstein. I don't think so, but I would have to see. Again, this was specifically in terms of context. You get a regression of context. You can say for this specific moment, to disambiguate the meaning of this sentence, one has to refer to the context, but you don't know what within the context is relevant, you don't know in advance, to this disambiguation. And then each context is set within a wider context, and one can't tell that it will not, in turn, what is relevant within any context will not be affected by what one perceives in the wider context. And I don't think there's a logical rule that will solve this problem. Again, if the speaker or the asker sees it differently, why there should be equal time. What is thought? No, it is interesting, though. It does seem to be the case, and this may be a phenomenon of thought without saying what thought is. Isn't it? It seems to me very interesting that, and is it the case that in virtually every area of inquiry, researchers can say a great deal that is relevant and true and pertinent, accurate, and so on about subsidiary problems, but when you uncover the basic one, like this, somehow the experts grow silent. Psychologists tell us all kinds of things, except when you ask what is mind. Electrical engineers, until you ask what is electricity. Biologists, life. I know I get it in what is religion. I've never been able to. I've read one account with 1,200 definitions and completed it no wiser than when I went in. And I've never been able to come to a really satisfactory definition. But I think I heard some dissent as to this notion that the basic concepts are elusive. Maybe in some fields they are not. How do you differentiate between mind and brain? One really ought to ask some of the other participants questions like that, working more specifically and in closer grips with. Well, I won't duck it completely. I tend to think of the brain as a physical mechanism which can be understood by observing externally its functioning. That's terribly vague and inadequate. Now, whether there is the mind, I tend to think of as a more inclusive term, as involving what it feels like for the inside and issues involving introspection, not just objective knowledge about the functioning of this organism or organ. Fortunately, there'll be a panel tomorrow, so others can have their say. If man was intelligent and aware enough of his own behaviors and thoughts, wouldn't it eventually be possible to program a machine to think? I don't know. There's a huge if on that. If we were aware enough, perhaps so. I think we're a long way of being thus aware, but I certainly wouldn't want to put any off-limit signs up, and who knows what in the vast distance things will be so different that they will be beyond our present powers to even imagine. If we think of Sir John's notion of evolution continuing, if the mind actually comes to function in ways perhaps as different from ours as ours are from the lower animals today, who knows what may be possible or impossible then. I certainly wouldn't want to close any doors. Is it not true that in order to build functioning computer circuits, it is necessary to understand basic logical properties of human reason? Certainly you'd have to understand something. And does this mean that in order to build thinking machines, one must understand the human thinking processes? Yeah, I would think that one might, by a kind of mutation, chance onto something, but in general, I think these programs are intentional in the sense that it is thought out what is willed that they should achieve, and so the understanding of the kind of thought that one is seeking tends to go ahead of the actual programming of machines to effect that kind of thought. I have 4 more. I'm counting on you to be the timekeeper, Mr. Chairman. Is it feasible that digital computers may in the foreseeable future master spoken language transposed from written language, for example, reading, with a high degree of accuracy? Well, they already can, it's my understanding, do some things in this area, in the sense of propping up a book and reading from that book. I'm not quite sure precisely where this process is. Last time I entered one of their laboratories, there was a loudspeaker on the wall which greeted me with, "How are you?" It was practically all vowels. They said that was a little bit easier to begin with. To convert the printed word into spoken language looks like it's going to be possible. I'm not sure to what extent there may have to be an altered or simplified spelling or an artificial spelling, but I'm not sure that there will have to be any. Analog computers are capable of processing far more possible variations in signals than digital computers, even if we do not utilize all these variations. Then is it not possible to conceptualize a data handling system that can sense, perceive, associate, decide, and recall, as well as the sensing devices feeding it data? To what extent are analog computers actually serviceable today? In these programs that are reported on the programs of language translation in the chess-playing devices, which are the ones that I'm more familiar with, they're always digital. But does the one who asked that question want to report as to what analog computers are today actually serviceably doing? Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, I would certainly concur with this, as long as you put it in the subjunctive, may. We wait. We wait to see. It's true. As I indicated, my comments were built upon digital computers, which are the only ones which seem to be operative in any really functional sense today. And what may happen in terms of another species of computers, we wait to see. But if it no longer is binary bits and no longer has to be plugged in terms of discrete bits of information and so on, why perhaps there will be a different order of approach to these problems. At the beginning you said there was no evidence to indicate the machines could think like humans. I thought I said just the opposite. They can think like some of the thought that humans do. I think there's no question about that. It's a question about whether they can simulate the full range, which the second quote that I cited holds the clear hope that they shall. Yet that seemed to be the point of your whole lecture. At the beginning you said there was no evidence to indicate that machines... Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a negative in this. At the beginning you said there was no evidence to think that machines could not think. We've got a double negative in there. Let's simplify it. At the beginning you said there was evidence to think that machines could think like human beings. Well, it comes down, I think they can in certain kinds, certain kinds of human thought, calculating thought. Can a computer be taught to maximize gains and minimize losses at the same time in game theory? One seems inherently opportunistic while the other is conservative. If true, would not this machine provide an answer? I don't know the answer to that. Can it maximize gains and minimize losses simultaneously? I'm not sure there's a general answer to that question. In some programs, some certain kinds of problems, this is just an intuitive thought on my part. I suspect they could do both, but I don't really know. What specifically is cybernetics? It comes from the Greek word meaning steersmanship, and it therefore moves on to data processing, and from there, to my knowledge, Norbert Wiener coined the word, and it has taken hold. Would you agree that if determinism is assumed in human thinking, it is at least theoretically possible to build a computer that could think as humans do? All right, theoretically, see, it seems to be the case that somehow the human mind, all the information that comes to it in the course of a human career gets somehow distilled or compounded, so it's there in varying degrees of aliveness, but affects our approach to a given problem. Now, the computers, this is one way of putting it, seem to want to think that this can be short-circuited by certain explicit rules. But that's what I have challenged this evening. I don't think human behavior is thus rule-determined. It is in part, but completely. So, see, when you talk about theoretically, okay, theoretically, if you build a machine which goes through a human career and finds out the kind of thing that a human being finds out by having a body and moving around objects and having purposes and aims and goals. In other words, if one builds a machine which is a human being in all these manifold ways, then theoretically it's possible. It may take about as long as it has taken for man to emerge in the evolutionary process. But you see, that gets into a kind of speculation which is much removed. We're just talking about science fiction rather than the realities of what is practically possible in our time. One last card. Can computers interpret dialects? For example, a southern accent. Again, I would, this is just intuition, that they could have a range of tolerance.
There are three romantic questions here, which I'm going to answer for Dr. Smith, and one I think that's addressed to the conference and the idea of the conference rather than to any particular member of it. What was the name of the blonde? Did you marry the Swedish girl? Did you marry the blonde Swede? Now the fact is, he did not marry this blonde Swede, but she is married. So what's the difference what her name was? And very seriously, this question says, am I the only one that is very often lost by all the speaker's own individualized and specific jargon? I don't know who sent this question up, but the answer is no. But that's not all the answer. In fact, I think the question really addresses itself to the nature of these conferences. Ought these conferences to be of such nature that they speak only about what you know in language and concepts with which you are already familiar? If so, I'm not really sure that it would be worth your while to come. A part of the value of these conferences is indeed that we are introduced to new concepts and new language with which we are not familiar. And technical language is, of course, for all of us, regardless of what our discipline is, a kind of shorthand by which we save time in talking about things which conceivably we could talk about less exactly in other language, but which we just don't have time to explain in all of its ramifications. So I think it's anyone who asked this question or who feels likewise should be heartened by the fact that all of us have some difficulty with some of the concepts and some of the language, and all of us are profiting by this kind of exposure. So get a good night's sleep and come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Good night.